Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into a really interesting mix of sources, mostly from a recent Lighthouse TV Tag 2 show.
Right. And our plan really is to pull out the key stuff, connect some dots between topics that might not seem linked at first.
Exactly, and hopefully give you a clearer picture of what's going on, why it matters, without, burying you in detail.
Think of it as us sorting through the noise for you, highlighting the important bits.
Okay, so the main source is that Lighthouse PV episode. They talked about PFAS in hobby chicken eggs, this RVM warning.
Yeah, and also the election of Friedrich Merz in Germany, his BlackRock connection. That's a big one.
And the never-ending nitrogen saga here in the Netherlands. Plus, we've got quick mentions of an NRC piece on the rule of law and a Telegraph article about Pakistan-India tensions bubbling up.
So for you, listening in, we'll guide you through. We'll point out the surprising facts, give some background, aim for those aha moments. Keep it straightforward.
Good. Let's start with something that might hit close to home, literally, if you have chickens. This RVM advice. Maybe don't eat eggs from hobby chickens because of PFAS. Let's unpack that. What did the chemists say?
Well, the Lighthouse TV hosts themselves kicked it off, asking, is this genuinely needed advice, or is it maybe stirring up unnecessary fear?
Okay.
And they brought in Dr. Job Hannenkamp, a chemist.
Yeah.
His view is, well, it's quite different.
Right. So he starts with the basics. What are PFAS?
Yeah, he explains they're this group of chemicals, good at repelling water and fat, think Teflon basically, been used for ages since the Manhattan Project in all sorts of things.
Okay, so they're not new.
Not at all. And this is his key point. PFAS are pretty much everywhere. The real change is that our technology, our analytical chemistry has gotten so much better recently, we can now detect incredibly tiny amounts.
Ah, so we're finding it because we can look for it much better now.
Exactly. Which leads him to ask, is this a genuine crisis or maybe more of a pseudo-crisis driven by our detection ability?
Interesting. So what about the levels found in the eggs? They were above the guidelines, right?
Yes, some were above the recommended weekly intake, and he clarified it's based on micrograms, not nanograms, like maybe first mentioned. But, and this is crucial, he emphasizes that exceeding that guideline doesn't automatically mean it's dangerous for your health right now. These norms, these safety levels, they always build in really large safety margins.
Okay, so there's a buffer zone, basically.
A big one. His point is that the concern here isn't about immediate acute chemical harm. It's more about potential long-term risks, which is something we tend to focus on more now that, basic safety is generally handled.
He made a comparison, didn't he, to the dioxin scare?
Yes, back in the 90s, everyone was panicking about dioxins. But looking back, while there were some acute issues, like with Viktor Yushchenko,
Yes, I remember that.
the widespread long-term health disaster that was feared didn't really materialize in the same way. And PFAS, he argues, are generally even more inert, chemically stable than dioxins.
Inert, meaning they don't react much in the body.
Right. They don't break down easily, which is why they can linger. That's the basis for the long-term concern, even if they aren't causing immediate problems.
What about the immune system worries? Did he address that?
He did. He basically said the epidemiological studies, the ones trying to link PFAS exposure to immune problems in humans, are often quite weak statistically. Inconclusive. So the evidence for PFAS being a major danger to our immune systems is, in his view, pretty marginal.
And it sounds like the way risk is being calculated might be a bit fuzzy, comparing different types of toxicity.
That's another issue he raised. It seems the RVM might have focused on norms related to liver toxicity based on animal tests with really high doses.
Okay.
But the EFSA norm, the European one for that weekly intake figure, is actually about immunotoxicity, potential immune effects. Comparing those two directly, he suggests, is problematic. It's not quite apples to apples.
And this PK thing, predicted equivalent quantities. That sounds complicated.
It's a bit technical, yeah. But the gist is, when they measure PFAS in eggs, they don't just report the raw amount. They often convert it into this PEQ value.
How?
It's based on how potent that specific PFAS is relative to a known reference PFAS, usually based on studies in rats. So the number you see isn't always the absolute amount measured.
It's more like an estimated impact score based on rat studies.
Kind of, yeah. It adds another layer of estimation and uncertainty when trying to figure out the real risk to humans.
Which maybe explains why he said something quite striking.
You mean about eating the eggs himself?
Yeah, he said he'd eat eggs from a helmet, which is known for PFAS issues.
Right. That really underscores his perspective on the gap between the perceived risk, the official warnings, and what he, as a chemist, sees as the actual acute danger. It's quite a statement.
It really is. He also talked about this wider angst culture, this culture of fear.
Yeah, this idea that maybe we're becoming a society that focuses a lot on potential anxieties, on risks.
And how does he connect that?
Yeah. Well, his argument is that this constant focus on fear and safety, perhaps unintentionally, can make people more accepting of, more government control, more regulations, all presented as being for our own good.
Interesting point. He links it to freedom, too.
He does. He suggests that if we become too focused on eliminating every single risk, we might end up limiting personal freedom and responsibility. He used the analogy of, like, overprotective parents.
Right, who don't let their kids take any risks, and then they can't cope later.
Exactly. It's that tension between safety and autonomy. How much risk is acceptable in a free society?
Okay. What about the imported eggs from Ukraine? That came up briefly.
Well, logically, eggs reflect the environment the chickens live in. So, as you pointed out, with the war in Ukraine, you might have different potential contaminants, maybe heavy metals from industrial damage or munitions. It's just a reminder that food sources are tied to their environment.
And testing every single hobby egg is.
Completely impractical. Logistically, economically, it just wouldn't work. And based on his risk assessment, probably unnecessary anyway.
Okay, let's pivot. Big shift in Germany. Friedrich Merz, elected chancellor. Sounds like that wasn't a given.
No, it apparently took a couple of rounds of voting. And why this matters so much for us here in the Netherlands? Well, our connection to Germany is huge.
Economically, especially.
Oh, absolutely. Economically, politically, culturally. Some people basically see the Netherlands as an economic province of Germany. What happens there directly affects us, which makes it kind of strange, as they noted, how little German is often taught here.
And Merz apparently didn't waste any time making big moves, even breaking promises.
That was a key point. Almost immediately, he signaled a major shift, breaking with German tradition and possibly promises by announcing a huge increase in borrowing, mainly for military spending.
How huge are we talking?
Massive numbers. The figures mentioned were between 500 billion and maybe even €1 trillion extra, and a huge chunk of that, maybe 500 billion, specifically for defense.
Wow. That's a really sharp turn for Germany, isn't it?
It's a massive departure from their post-WWII cautious approach. And it fits into a wider European trend, something like 800 billion euros being earmarked for defense across the continent.
What about the rest of the money? Not all for defense.
No, the rest is supposedly for things like infrastructure. Germany's IT infrastructure is apparently quite behind, plus energy security and climate measures.
How did the financial expert on the show view this?
It was nuanced. They sort of acknowledged Germany did need investment after years of maybe stagnation under Merkel. They pointed to Merkel's mistakes, like closing nuclear plants.
Right.
So they gave Merz some maybe hesitant credit for taking action, even while noting the concerns about his BlackRock past.
But definite worries about this scale of military spending.
Oh, yeah. Terms like military spending psychosis were mentioned. Is this level of rearmament really necessary? What are the underlying drivers? Big questions there.
And does this tie into the bigger European picture, like a common defense force?
Some see it that way. This push for stronger European defense could be seen as another step towards, a more integrated Europe, which of course others resist, wanting to keep national control.
And the money. All this debt. Who pays?
Well, ultimately, us, the public. That was made pretty clear. Future taxes, potential inflation, economic adjustments. The bill comes due eventually.
And there was talk about maybe keeping a closer eye on our savings to fund this.
Yeah, things like this Saving Investment Union initiative were mentioned. The concern raised was whether this could lead to more oversight of personal savings, pensions, investments, maybe channeling those funds towards these big government projects.
Potentially reducing our control over our own money.
That's the potential implication, yes. Less individual control.
Okay, let's talk about that BlackRock connection more directly.
Jim.
Merz wasn't just linked to them, he was
Chairman of the supervisory board for BlackRock Germany, a very senior position. And BlackRock, they're arguably the most powerful investment management company on the planet.
Trillions under management, including Dutch pensions.
Exactly. Their influence goes way beyond just finance. It stretches into politics, potentially shaping global events.
So putting Merz in charge of Germany, some see that as BlackRock getting one of their own in a key position.
That's certainly the perspective some hold, given his background, his network, his understanding of global finance. Appointing him chancellor could be seen as, well, strategically beneficial for an entity like BlackRock.
Which obviously raises the conflict of interest question.
Absolutely. If the leader of Germany has deep ties to BlackRock, will government policy, especially with all this new spending, somehow favor BlackRock's interests, directly or indirectly? It's a valid concern.
Though the expert on the show saw maybe another side to his background.
Yeah, again, nuanced. While acknowledging the conflict of interest worries, the expert also kind of valued Moltz's business background, contrasted it with career politicians who maybe lack that real-world economic experience.
But still didn't like the broken promises.
No, breaking election promises was definitely seen as a negative, regardless of his background.
And the expectation is that the Netherlands will probably follow Germany's lead.
That seems to be the assumption. More spending here, maybe loosening the purse strings, which means more Dutch debt, too.
Which could affect the euro. All this debt piling up.
That's a fear, yes. If major Eurozone economies all take on significantly more debt, it could weaken the euro over time.
So the advice for individuals watching all this
Was basically about taking personal responsibility for your finances. Maybe moving away from relying solely on third-party institutions like banks or pension funds.
towards things you own directly.
Right. Considering assets like physical precious metals, maybe Bitcoin, things where you have direct ownership and control. They used an analogy about Abraham's wealth being directly held.
Got it. Okay, third big topic, nitrogen. The Dutch saga continues. Another ultimatum.
Yep, Groundhog Day again. Nature groups led by Johan Wallenbroek's MOB have given Minister Wiersma another deadline. Change course on nitrogen or face more lawsuits. It's just the same cycle repeating.
And the minister's position hasn't really changed, still focusing on farmers.
It seems that way. Indications are farmers will still be expected to make the biggest cuts. It's the same fundamental issue that's been dragging on.
And the rules themselves, the low limits per hectare, they just create endless problems, don't they?
Huge bureaucratic headaches, yeah. The limits are incredibly strict compared to elsewhere.
And MOD and the others are basically saying the government's plans are impossible anyway.
Their argument is that the current plans just won't achieve the goals. They're demonstrably flawed, so they're threatening more legal challenges.
It really does feel like Groundhog Day. No real solution in sight.
None that addresses the core problems structurally, no. Just
Oh.
kicking the can down the road, it seems.
And there was a point made about whether the politicians involved even understand the science properly.
That's a worrying suggestion, isn't it? The idea that some decision makers might not grasp basic distinctions, like between nitrogen oxide and ammonia, which have different sources and effects. If that's true, how can they make good policy?
How did we even get here, these EU directives?
It goes back to the EU Birds and Habitats directives. Noble goals, nature conservation. But the way they were translated into national Dutch law, particularly around nitrogen deposition, was exceptionally strict. That's the root of this specific crisis.
And now we have this massive clash, nature goals versus, well, farmers' livelihoods.
Exactly. Climate goals, biodiversity goals on one side. On the other, you have the huge impact on agriculture, farm suicides, the protests, the rise of the BBB party. It's deeply divisive.
Has the government's approach changed at all? They moved away from the KDW, didn't they?
They did shift focus from the critical deposition value to broader emission targets. But Dr. Hannenkamp, the chemist again, argued on the show that this is mostly cosmetic. It doesn't fix the fundamental flaws in the approach.
So what is Hannenkamp's take on the nitrogen problem itself?
He basically argues that while you can construct a problem narrative, the whole thing has become so complex and politicized that the actual scientific reality is obscured. He's very critical of the models used, like the Arius model for deposition, calling them flawed.
And the data going into the models.
Also questionable, he says. Emission figures, like from the NEMA model, are often based on estimates. How accurate are they? Nobody really knows for sure. Basing huge policies on potentially shaky data is problematic.
So if the current approach is flawed, what's his alternative?
It's quite radical. He suggests rethinking the whole Natura 2000 designation, maybe reclassifying the status of these protected areas.
Reclassifying them, how?
For example, maybe defining heathland, which needs management anyway, as a type of forest land, which might have different nitrogen criteria. He argues the EU rules actually allow some flexibility in defining the state of conservation.
That's a different way of looking at it. He also said Dutch nature is kind of unique.
Yeah, that much of it, like the heathlands, isn't wild nature, but actually landscapes created by centuries of farming and land use. They require human management to stay as they are.
So if you focus on managing the land itself,
then maybe the precise level of nitrogen deposition becomes less critical than simply stopping all deposition. It shifts the focus.
And he connects this back to the angst culture idea again.
Yes. Just like PFAS, the nitrogen issue can be framed as an urgent environmental safety crisis, which then justifies very restrictive policies.
And assigning blame, that precautionary culture.
He sees nitrogen as a classic example. Environmental decline happens, so you find someone to blame agriculture, in this case, and impose measures based on the precautionary principle, even if the causal links or data are uncertain.
Are there maybe other motives besides just the environment? Land use?
That possibility was raised. Could these nitrogen rules also serve other agendas, like freeing up agricultural land for housing or other development, these green for red ideas? It's speculation, but it's out there.
And what about that motion in Parliament to use actual measurements instead of just models?
Apparently, a motion from Forum for Democracy suggested prioritizing empirical, on-the-ground measurements. But the report was that Minister Wiersma basically ignored it, which, if true, raises questions about listening to Parliament or considering alternative data sources.
The economic impact of all this must be huge.
Oh, undoubtedly. This self-imposed nitrogen lockdown is seen as very damaging economically, especially for agriculture, but also construction and other sectors. Concerns for the future economy are serious.
So Hanningkamp's final proposal is really tear it all down.
Pretty much. His view is radical.
Hmm.
Overturn the current EU directives and how they're applied nationally.
Huh?
Get rid of the critical deposition values. Let farmers farm, basically. Emphasize freedom and property rights. He even compared it quite strongly to historical attacks on farmers by authoritarian regimes.
Wow. And this also links to the housing crisis, doesn't it?
Indirectly, yes. If nitrogen rules block construction projects, it just makes the housing shortage even worse.
Oh, that was quite a journey through those topics.
It really was. From PFAS and eggs to Germany's new direction under MERS and the BlackRock shadow, and then the deep complexities of the Dutch nitrogen fight.
And what stands out is how these things, though seemingly separate, actually connect.
Definitely. We see these recurring themes, don't you? Perceived risk versus maybe the actual science. Government intervention versus individual freedom. Big economic shifts happening. The power of finance.
And this reliance on models versus actual measurement keeps popping up too.
That's a big one. Models predicting risk, models driving policy, but questions about the data and the models themselves.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening as we wrap up this deep dive. Thinking about all these environmental rules, economic policies maybe driven by giant financial players, the balance between us as citizens and the state. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What are your fundamental assumptions about how things should work? What role do you see for yourself in shaping any of this?
Yeah, it's definitely food for thought. This dive is just scratching the surface, really. Hopefully it encourages you to keep looking into these things, keep thinking critically, and form your own informed opinions.